All right, welcome back, fellow scientists. This is our last and final video of the Chapter 8 and 9 Flipped Classroom. We're going to be still focusing on learning objective number 6, right? We're relating photosynthesis and cellular respiration to food webs and energy pyramids. We did that in the last video. The last video we talked about energy flowing. The flip side of that coin is that matter cycles, right? The whole entire world, the whole entire universe is made up of two basic things, matter and energy. Okay, and so energy flows through our ecosystems in our world, and matter cycles. So go ahead and take out a blank piece of paper. Again, this is going to be a lot of diagrams and not a lot of writing, so yay. And go ahead and write down matter cycles. And just like last time, we talked about carnivore and omnivore, different things like that. A lot of review from elementary school. So this is going to be more review from elementary school, hopefully. There are different cycles of matter in the world. So the first one and most obvious one is water. So go ahead and write down the water cycle. Right, and then the water cycle, go ahead and write down these words. So the water cycle, there's evaporation. Right? And then from that evaporation, we could get precipitation, right? So that's one way it could go, right? Another way it could go is we could transport it over land, right? Think of this as like the Pacific Ocean, and this is like Seattle and Portland and stuff like that. And then these are the Cascades, right? So then as the moist air rises, then it cools and it condenses, and then we get precipitation, and then that falls, and then that waters the plants, and that's why it's so green on the west side of the Cascades, and so dry and brown and deserty over here on the east side of the Cascades. And then we get runoff, which goes back into the ocean, and then that evaporates. And so it's a cycle, right? We're not losing any water to outer space. We're not gaining any water. We don't have space rain, right? So all of the water that ever has been and ever will be is here. Okay, perfect. So that's one cycle. Another cycle is the carbon cycle, right? And this relates to climate change and global warming and different things like that. So this is a graphic. This is a picture from the book that I use for AP Biology, and it talks about CO2 because that's the most common way to store carbon. And these numbers right here, this is astonishing. So these numbers represent grams of carbon, but it's not like just 750 grams are in the atmosphere. It's 750 times 10 to the 15th grams, right? So if you write it out, this is 1 times 10 to the 15th. So we have hundreds, we have thousands, we have millions, we have billions, we have trillions, we have quadrillions. I think I said that right. Hopefully I said that right. So this is 750 quadrillion grams of carbon are stored in the atmosphere. Okay, so then from that atmosphere, we can have plants that take in 100 quadrillion grams of carbon per year through the process that we've already studied called, yep, that's right, photosynthesis takes in carbon dioxide, right? And then we can have animals like lions and tigers and bears, right, and humans who give off carbon dioxide, 50 quadrillion grams of it annually through cellular respiration, right? And then we can also have human activities, the burning of fossil fuels. So here in the Pacific Northwest, it doesn't really pertain to us, but other areas of the country, they get their electricity from coal-burning power plants. Coal is a fossil fuel that we dig up out of the earth and that we can use to burn to get energy, right? We travel in cars, which burn gasoline. We travel in trucks, which burn diesel. Some of us do our cooking over propane or natural gas. All of those are fossil fuels, right? And so you'll notice the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, 750 quadrillion grams. The amount of carbon that are locked up in fossil fuels is 25 million quadrillion grams. Right, so that is a huge number. That is by far the biggest number, you know, on this chart. And so the people that are talking about climate change and global warming and we're burning too many fossil fuels and different things like that are recognizing that there is a lot of carbon that is locked up in these fossil fuels, and we're not losing any. We're not giving any to outer space. We're not getting any, but we're just changing where that carbon dioxide is stored. The way that it looks now, if we continue to take fossil fuels out of the ground and continue to burn them and put them in the atmosphere, it seems to be, based on the most current research and data, it seems to be that most of that carbon dioxide is going to be absorbed by the oceans, right? Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, except if you live in the ocean, absorbing carbon dioxide actually makes the oceans more acidic. And if you live in the ocean and your environment suddenly turns acidic, either you change, you mutate, you survive, or you die. That's simple Darwinian evolution. And it seems like most of the corals and coral reefs are not changing or not mutating, and they're dying. So that's, you know, a slight concern. Possibly. That's all that I'm going to say on that. I don't really want to spend a lot of time talking about carbon. I want to mainly talk about nitrogen. Nitrogen is another nutrient that cycles. And nitrogen is, I think, the most important nutrient because it is what biologists call a limiting nutrient. So go ahead and write this down. All right, so you should have matter cycles, you should have water with our words, you should have carbon dioxide, and then you should have nitrogen. And then underneath nitrogen, go ahead and write down that nitrogen is most typically a limiting nutrient, right? And of course, you can read, it means that there's not a lot of nitrogen, and so as nutrients go, that's going to be used up first. And once it's used up, then the plants or the animals can't do any more growing and they can't use nitrogen. Now, nitrogen is really important because it's actually a part of a nucleotide, which, if you'll remember from chapter 2, is part of a nucleic acid. Examples are DNA and RNA. And every single living thing relies on DNA and RNA to control its cellular processes and to tell the cell what to do. Remember, DNA is in the nucleus. Nucleus is the boss of the cell. We studied that in chapter 7, right? So it all comes back together. So nitrogen is very, very, very important. Because of that, people have figured this out. People are pretty smart. Because nitrogen is important and because nitrogen is typically in short supply, nitrogen is a key component in fertilizers. Right? If you want your plants to grow, if you want to have a good crop, a good yield, then you fertilize your plants, because if you supply it with more nitrogen, then it's going to grow more. It's going to make more DNA, it's going to make more cells, it's going to get bigger. Okay? Great. Except if you do like a lot of farming and if you use a lot of fertilizer, and if a lot of people do a lot of farming because they have to feed a lot of people, like for instance, the United States in the continent of North America. Right? So here's Texas, here's Florida, here's the Gulf of Mexico, and this is the Midwest. This is the breadbasket of America. This is the drainage that drains into the Mississippi River that goes into the Gulf of Mexico. So all of these farms, all of these farmers are doing great and doing good things, and I wouldn't be alive and I wouldn't be eating if they didn't grow food. So thank you very much, farmers. But they're using a lot of fertilizer to feed us Americans. And the plants, they use so much fertilizer that the plants don't actually take up all that fertilizer, but some of the fertilizer runs off when it rains and runs into the streams and lakes and rivers and then ultimately into the Gulf of Mexico. You think, oh, well, Mr. Leo, that's great because now the Gulf of Mexico, things in the Gulf of Mexico have excess nitrogen. That's amazing. Now it's not so much of a limiting nutrient. Well, for some things it is. If you are an algae, that's a good thing. As algae are small, algae are simple, they can use the nitrogen first, right? And so they make what are called algal blooms. So here's a picture of an algal bloom. This green mat is a whole bunch of algae, and then this is what it looks like when there's no algal bloom, or this is an area where the algae are not yet. Right? And this is what an algae bloom looks like from space, right? So all of this stuff in here, that's not the continental shelf, that's algae, okay? And then out here is not algae, right? I think, well, Mr. Leo, so what? Algae, it makes oxygen, it does photosynthesis, that's good, right? Well, again, depending on who you are, okay? So the algae, it lives up here at top, on the top of the water, and yeah, it makes oxygen and it releases out oxygen, and that's great. If you are a plant that lives down on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, because this thick mat of algae is directly over top of you, you can't get any sunlight. So you can't do photosynthesis because that requires sunlight. So you can have all the nitrogen in the world, right? And if you don't have sunlight, then that becomes the limiting factor, and then you die. Right? So, okay, so the plants die. Well, there are things down here that eat the plants that could die, right? and they only eat plants and they don't eat algae because, as we talked about before, with our food webs, right? Some things can only eat plants, some things can only eat other things like little fish that eat the plants or eat the algae. Oops, sorry, other way. Right, so if you're a plant living on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, algal blooms, not really a good thing, right? Also, if you're an animal, right, living on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, also possibly not a good thing, right? So little crabbies, they can actually survive on water or on land, so they can kind of escape, right? But these fish, they obviously can't survive on land, and if all of the plants that they eat, or if all of the smaller animals that eat the plants are dead, then they die too, right? And so excess nitrogen actually has a bad effect on, or a detrimental effect on the Gulf of Mexico ecosystem. It's great for the algae, but it's not great for all of the other things that live in the Gulf of Mexico. So what's your big takeaway? If you become a farmer, use fertilizer responsibly, right? And if you decide to like have a little garden and a little tomato patch or whatever, use fertilizer responsibly, and please don't let it go into lakes or streams or rivers or runoff, yeah, into those kind of things, because that's bad for the environment. And now you know why that's bad for the environment. So this has been Mr. Leo. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the flip side.